Weightlifting is a sport that is all about performing at your maximum capacity for a short amount of time. A competition is divided into two different types of lifts. The snatch, where the weight has to travel from the floor to above the head in one smooth motion, and the clean and jerk, where the weight is first lifted from the ground to the shoulders, and then from the shoulders above the head. The total score is a combination of the weight somebody can do in each lift. Each athlete only has 3 attempts at each lift, which means that they have to leave everything out on the floor in only 6 attempts. Since there are so few attempts and athletes have to lift enormously heavy weights, you would expect that every athlete is extremely hyped up to try and get every single little bit of strength out of their bodies. Yet, when you watch weightlifting, there's an interesting combination of extremely hyped up athletes who might scream and yell before and after lifts.
Nice little bow to the judges.
And athletes that seem icy and maybe almost not engaged. So how is it possible that these two extremely different approaches can lead to the same outcome? In this episode of JWK Explains, I will address how different levels of activation can lead to different outcomes in different athletes. Before we have a look at the individual differences between athletes, we first have to look at the overall relationship between activation, or arousal as it is called in scientific terms, and performance. The predominant theory that describes this relationship is the inverted U hypothesis. Basically what this means is that increases in activation will lead to increases in performance. That is, until that relationship reaches a peak. From that moment onward, any more increases in arousal will actually lead to lower performance. And I'm sure that you've experienced this before. Maybe you have experience of being really slow and not very hyped up for a competition, and that led to a bad performance. But on the other hand, maybe you've also experienced being overly hyped up, having so much energy and being so engaged that it led to a bad performance. The inverted U hypothesis states that there is a sweet spot somewhere in the middle that will lead to optimal performance. However, if we just take the inverted U hypothesis and apply it to the case of our weightlifters, we would have to see athletes that prepare exactly the same to reach the same level of activation and the same level of performance. But, like I mentioned in the beginning, this is not the case. And this is because the inverted U hypothesis does not look at individual differences between athletes. And that's where the Izod model comes in. Izod stands for individual zones of optimal functioning. And similar to the inverted U hypothesis, it also states that there is a sweet spot at which activation leads to the best performance. However, what the Izod model adds is that this inverted U, this peak, is at a different level of activation for each individual athlete. So an athlete with a low Izod profile might need way lower levels of activation to reach his optimal performance. But an athlete with a high Izod profile needs high activation to reach optimal functioning. If we plot these both athletes in one graph, it would look something like this. At an arousal level where athlete 1 is completely over the top of his curve and overactivated, athlete B is actually underactivated to reach optimal performance. This individual relationship between activation and performance exists in every sport, and therefore it's always really hard to tell from the outside whether an athlete is close to his activation for optimal performance or not. With the knowledge that each individual has their own sweet spot to reach their best performance, what can you do to find your sweet spot and come up with strategies to recreate that level? First of all, you need to recall the best 3 performances you had in your life. Try to remember as many details and really take yourself back to that event. You then rate the level of activation you had during those events on a scale from 1 to 10. 10 means that your activation was absolutely through the roof. You have never been so hyped before in your life. And 1 being, I was really calm, almost like I just got out of bed. Once you have these 3 numbers, you have a pretty good idea of what your optimal levels of activation is for a good performance. What you need to do then is come up with strategic routines to help recreate that level. Now, this is a complex process and you might need the help of a mental performance consultant to really be able to effectively recreate levels of activation in different scenarios. But remember, finding your level can really help recreate and achieve great performances. But what works for you might not work for others, because in the end, everyone has their own individual sweet spot. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of JWK Explains, and that you learned something about the relationship between levels of activation and performance. If you did enjoy watching this, make sure you leave a like, put in the comments what you thought about the episode, and subscribe to the channel. Also make sure that you follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook to keep up to date on all kinds of content regarding mental training. I hope to see you in the next episode of JWK Explains.